Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, the Real Seeker. And today is a really special treat. It's been a while since I've done a Shroud Wars discussion show. And for today's episode, I'm really excited. We have someone that the audience is well familiar with in these Shroud Wars debates, Hugh Farey. Welcome back to the show there, Hugh.
Hello.
Awesome. And someone that I'm really excited to be on the show. It's their first time on the show. And they're a historian and expert in the field that we're going to be talking about today, Dr. Cheryl White. Hey, Cheryl.
Hey, glad to be here. Thank you.
Awesome. And kind of helping me out in the co-host role, we have Caleb Jackson. Hey, Caleb, how are you?
I'm doing good, Dale. Thank you for asking.
Awesome. Okay, so this one's going to be kind of a quick one, just to respect my guests' time limits. It's going to be about an hour or so. But the first thing I just want to do is want to throw it open to the guests to kind of introduce themselves as to who they are. Hugh, obviously, again, the audience is familiar with you, but you want to maybe just give us an update as to what you've been up to and that sort of thing?
Right. Well, nothing much different from what I was before. I've spent all my life as a science teacher in a Catholic school, so I've been involved in Catholic things for quite a long time, and I've been fully investigating the Shroud for the last, I can't remember, 10 years or so. I went to the Toronto conference on the Shroud with Cheryl, among other people. I think last time I saw you, I've now taken a postgraduate certificate of something or other in Shroud Studies. What's it called? A postgraduate certificate with the University of the Queen of the Angels in Queen of the Apostles in Rome, and I'm due to go to Portugal in November to the first international conference on relics.
Oh, how wonderful! I need some details about that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I saw the from the Shroud Science Group. I got an email.
Well, I hope so.
That post-grad
COVID
program there. Okay, awesome. So let's turn it over to Cheryl. Obviously, you're new to the show. Do you want to just sort of introduce us as to who you are, your relationship to the Shroud, and maybe a little bit about your faith journey, if you don't mind?
Sure. So I'm a history professor at Louisiana State University in Shreveport, Louisiana, where I've been for 25 years. My field is primarily medieval Europe and early modern Europe, with a specific interest really concentrated in the years about 1200 to 1500 is really my primary area. And obviously Christian church history as well. You can't really study medieval Europe and not be drawn into that field. I have an interest in the cult of relics and personal piety surrounding relics. So my interest in the Shroud really goes back to my undergraduate years, when in the early 1980s, the very first information about the Shroud from the Shroud of Turin research project, the only fully scientific comprehensive examination that's ever been permitted of the cloth, that began to be produced in peer-reviewed materials in the early 1980s. And so my interest goes back at least that far, probably almost 40 years now. I've been studying the Shroud. And then when I was in graduate school, in 1988 when the carbon-14 dating results were published. And so as a medieval historian, particularly one with an interest in relics and that cult of relics, I was immediately drawn in even more because I believed it to be a medieval creation at that point. So that's pretty much my journey. I have as a historian who's interested in the purity of my discipline, I have a pretty exacting standard for what constitutes historical inquiry in this field. And a lot of what I've read over the last 40 years has not really been that. So I was drawn into doing more primary research, and I've been in the Vatican Secret Archives 3 times now to look at very specific or looking for specific information and documents. And I've published some journal articles, presented at a few conferences, and am actually on the board of the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association. So, and my final thing is that I'm currently consulting on the new exhibit that opens February 2022 at the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. I was the historical consultant on that project.
Awesome. So yeah, as you can tell, I'm really looking forward to doing this show. the topic of debate is going to be the historicity of the shroud, obviously, and obviously you're an expert in that medieval period. So the first thing I want to do, for the sake of time, I want to throw it open to Hugh first to make his sort of opening case, uh, trying to prove that the shroud is in fact medieval, apart from the carbon 14. We have that memorandum. He's got another piece of evidence. So, Hugh, yeah, do you want to maybe give your opening speech and just keep in mind the time constraints when you're giving it?
Yeah, I'll be very brief, which probably means I'll be too quick. From a historical point of view, no, I'd like to ignore the Darcy Memorandum. I'd like to pretend it didn't happen, that the bloke who wrote it didn't exist, and if he did, he didn't send it, and all the rest of it. What I will go straight to is the papal bull of Clement VII, who said, if this shroud is going to be displayed, it must be announced in a loud voice that it is not the burial shroud of Christ, and there must be no extra candles, extra vestments, and he goes into a long list of the vestments. There must be no copes permitted. And the description of exactly how the shroud is to be presented without any lighting, incense, or vestments that were untypical, promulgated by Clement VII, and maybe he'd never heard of Darcy, but he certainly said it. So, and he, we have copies of that, as Cheryl will know. So that's the historical announcement that I would make, and then I would go on to my own little sort of hobby horse, as it were, which is in medieval times, all over Europe, there were little plays enacted, firstly on Easter Sunday and also at Corpus Christi, in which three clerics dressed as the holy women at the tomb would go to the north transept of the church, where they would find an Easter sepulchre, which was a kind of box, and sitting on the box there was another cleric, also dressed as an angel, who said, "What are you looking for?" in Latin, of course. And they said, "We're looking for Jesus Christ." And the angel on the box said, "He has risen. Go and show everybody. Take the shroud. Take his shroud. Take it and show everybody the shroud." And so they did. So there were lots of shrouds dotted around medieval Europe. Now, we have no particular evidence that any of them had images on them of any kind. However, images were involved because the whole thing was extended slightly towards Good Friday. The 2 days before Easter Sunday, quite frequently, the crucifix was taken down, and sometimes it had folding arms so that it would fit in the wood. Sometimes they would swap it for a statue, which would go into the sepulchre, and it would look like this. This one is from Weinhausen in Germany, and as you can see, it's not a fully three-dimensional sculpture. Can you see it clearly enough?
Yes.
Yeah.
It's almost like a rather lumpy bas relief. But that is the one of the Easter sepulchres. It still survives. And one of the traditions was, depending on which part of Europe you were or what tradition you were followed, that the body would be wrapped in the shroud. On Easter Saturday, whoever was responsible for the church would take the statue away, and so that there was nothing left except the shroud, which the holy women would then, whoops, it's upside down, here we go, would then take out and exhibit to the, oh, it's a bit blurred, is it? Exhibit to the congregation. Now, this particular example shows the size of shroud that might be used in such a ceremony, and that picture is painted on the side of one of the Easter sepulchres, so it's not just a picture of random angels holding a shroud. So that's the sort of thing that I'm aiming for, that I think is the provenance of the shroud. Just before I stop on that one, I'd like to just mention that when you started, you said that Hugh Farey is going to try and prove that the shroud is medieval. No, I'm not anymore. I'm sure that Cheryl is going to prove that the shroud is not medieval. We're scientists and historians. We don't do proof. We provide evidence which inclines us to think one thing or the other. Wouldn't you agree? I could see you smiling.
I absolutely agree with that. Absolutely agree with that.
Okay, that's me.
Thank you. Awesome. I see. I'm a philosopher, so I think of proof on the preponderance of evidence. So yeah, we're all on the same page. So.
Well, Dale, I also have a master's in philosophy, so I teach that as well. I have that perspective too. So.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I'm a first year student at Ryerson. So all right, cool. So Cheryl, yeah, I want to turn it over to you. I want you to be able to give your sort of opening case to Hugh's case from the memo, as well as that papal bull and the twin ritual. So yeah, go for it.
Sure. So, I mean, Hugh raises some great points, and it's certainly true that, this is, and speaking in philosophical terms, if I can for just a second, now that I know that you're oriented that way, the greatest epistemological challenge we have, or the greatest issue related to knowing the truth about the shroud, comes from this very obscure history. And he makes reference to the Darcy's memorandum, which I think the consensus of shroud scholars, at least in my camp, among historians, remain dubious about its authenticity. Not that he didn't write it, but it appears to have never been sent. And we really don't know in context what motivated that particular memorandum in the first place. The bull of Clement VII, to me, I've never thought about it before. And actually, Hugh, thank you for bringing this up, because you've given me something else to ponder about the shroud. But Pope Clement VII is, as I recall, is writing about the regulations regarding the display of this purported shroud in France in a way that is not inconsistent with what popes across the ages have had to say about various relics in the possession of the church. They don't pronounce on their authenticity. So for instance, if we have a relic on display at our local cathedral, the bone of a saint is what I'm thinking of that we have, or actually we have pieces of the heart of a saint. It's on display, but there's certain rules under which it can be displayed. There's certain liturgical norms that apply to the display of relics that always have applied. So I'm not sure that I completely agree that that's significant in the history of the cloth. I will tell you that I certainly agree that there were many cloths that were on display that I think that perhaps even the one that is in Turin, Italy today was probably copied at some point. But for me, what it boils down to is not really the history of the cloth as a historian. Because, and let me just see if I can succinctly say this, we're really tripped up by our vocabulary. And this is a point I made in a presentation I gave in Toronto that where I met Hugh. We're tripped up by our vocabulary. We're limited in very many ways by that, because anything that appears in the historical record before its documented entry into history in the mid-1350s in Lille, France, is not going to be called the same thing that we know it by today. And so there's many references to the sindone or the shroud or the burial linens or the cloth, the sacred linen. There's many references, but as a historian, I have to look at that and say, we don't know that we're talking about the same cloth that is in Turin, Italy today. We don't know that. And so philosophically, for me, that's a challenge. I think sometimes historians try to make the leap and connect the dots when, in the absence of previously unknown direct historical evidence, we're trying to make a case we just can't make. So for me, that remains an open question. All of that remains an open question.
Awesome. All right, thanks. So yeah, I think what I want to do at this point, I want to have some kind of back and forth between Hugh and Cheryl for a bit.
Okay.
Maybe about 10 minutes. And then.
Well, yes. Do you want me to say? Well, when you display relics, and sure enough, yes, the church has certain standard conditions. Yes. However, I very, very much doubt if the moment the church door is opened, somebody is instructed to stand in front of it and say, this is not the crown of thorns, or this is not, that Pope instructed an announcement to be made, this is not the shroud of Jesus. And that is quite unusual, I would say, for anything which might be, I mean, you're quite right that the church that never verifies a relic, hardly ever verifies a relic, but it's very rare that it actually definitely denies one.
Right. I still don't see the real veracity in that, because the circumstances surrounding that memorandum itself and surrounding Pope Clement's bull.
Never mind the memorandum.
Okay, we'll leave the memorandum out of it.
Authenticists keep bringing up the memorandum. It's the bull.
Okay,
yes.
But Pope Clement, I won't mention the memorandum again. Pope Clement's bull, I think if you take it in isolation, perhaps it means something. When you take it with all of the evidence we have across the known history of the cloth, it really stands out as an artifact, as something that we can't really build a consensus around its significance because of everything else we have. What about Pope Julius II in 1506, who declares that it is worthy of veneration? And then, of course, if you think about the 20th century, since the image in the cloth, the complexity in it has become known to us, which incidentally, we can get to that. That's one of the reasons I have a problem with it being medieval. The 20th century, every single pope has declared it worthy of veneration, not pronouncing on the authenticity of it, but that it is worthy to be venerated. And in fact, all of the popes of the 20th century have venerated it. So I think that if we want to take isolated cases and isolated disputes and skeptics and do that, to me, that's not really, I'd like to elevate the integrity of our scholarship and our inquiry to incorporate all the disciplines and to incorporate all we know. And to me, that's the big challenge we have in Shroud Studies, is bringing all the information to bear.
Awesome. And do you guys have anything else you want to discuss, like the quem?
Oh yes. Oh, that was, as it were.
You bet. So my problem really with seeing this as a medieval cloth, and you and I talked about this in Toronto, is not historical. My problem is that there is, as a medieval historian, I've always had a very hard time synthesizing what I know about the cloth and its 17 very unique image characteristics, the three-dimensional properties of the image itself. The complexity of it presupposes that this medieval artist would have had to have been an expert in many, many, many fields that the 21st century doesn't know. And so that's my biggest challenge with trying to place this in the Middle Ages. And I think it's why we have to leave the question open. I actually don't believe any of us should be pronouncing on the authenticity of this cloth. And I'll tell you why. If it is in fact the burial shroud of Christ, and this image is the physical remain of a metaphysical event or a natural remain of a supernatural event, we're never going to prove that. That can't be proven. It's beyond the limits of human knowledge. We can't ask science to do what science can't do. So I like to leave this as an open question. The mystery.
Interesting. All right, cool. So if you guys don't have anything else you'd like to go back and forth on, I think Oh, you would? Okay, cool. Yeah.
That's a very short conversation. So can I throw in another thing about relics, which is that by 1350, all the relics of the Passion of Christ had been discovered, had been brought back to Europe, and was scattered around Europe, usually multiple times.
Right.
So everyone who was interested in finding whether the shroud, Paris, Milan, Spain, There was even a piece in Reading in Britain. Hooray! And then out of nowhere comes a new relic. Now, the essence of a relic, the authority of a relic, was its provenance.
Mm-hmm.
And the shroud comes with no provenance. Nobody speaks in favor of it. Nobody at all speaks in favor of it, except for the Dean of Leary, who says, this is the shroud.
Mm-hmm.
Even Geoffrey de Charny, we don't know what he says of it because he died. But when his younger son started to exhibit it in 1389, he exhibits it saying, this is a representation of the shroud. When they finally sell the shroud on to, give the shroud to, what's his name, Hubert de Villesexel, or whatever his name was, they hand it on as a representation of the shroud. The thing is that it has no provenance, it has no authority, and this is most unlike any other relic. If you look up the crown of thorns, if you look up the holy tunics of Trier, or there's two of them, isn't there? Look up the holy nails. Every one of them has got a detailed story from the moment it arrived in wherever they are, all the way back. This particular nail was found by Queen Helena, and it was changed into a brass now in, I think it's in Milan. Is it that particular one? I mean, there's about 20 nails dotted about, but they all have provenance. And what gives them their authority as a relic is their till 100 years later, when they started making up provenance for it, going, oh, it came from here or it came from there. And indeed, the provenance that they made up for it was indeed in large part conflicting. So that's another thing which I think speaks against the shroud being an actual relic.
Well,
And possibly, yeah, sorry, I'll stop at that.
No, the fact of the matter is that first of all, I disagree that all relics have provenance. That's not true at all. And I also disagree that, I mean, anything that has a footprint in the Middle Ages, we are absolutely right to be skeptical of. Anything that has a footprint there, I mean, like a historical footprint. The thing that we cannot get away from, though, Hugh, is the characteristics of the shroud itself. We cannot get away from the fact that the imaging characteristics, the three-dimensionality of the image, the complexity of it, its anthropologically, forensically accurate image, something that a Leonardo da Vinci or even a brilliant mind like that could not have created something that is so forensically perfect, leaves for me a big question about where its actual provenance is. We cannot escape that, and nobody knew that until the 20th century. I'd like to remind everybody, all the listeners, that nobody knew that this image was there in its complexity until it was photographed for the first time in 1898. And interestingly, that seems to coincide with all the concern about the historical provenance of the shroud comes about in the early 1900s, really in response to the world seeing for the first time what is in the cloth. And we cannot deny what is in the cloth. So lacking any other explanation, again, I want to leave the question open because I know today of no medieval artist who could have produced such a thing.
I think Simone de Martini could probably have done it.
I disagree. 17 image characteristics have to be met in order to match the method. And there is nobody that can do that. Nobody.
Okay.
Well,
sorry.
I think you're drifting from the historical
Absolutely,
into the scientific, which is very much
I'm drifting from the historical because our documented history begins in 1355. Where the cloth may have been before 1355 is very much in question. And I think I prefaced this whole conversation with that is the challenge for history. So we need to rely upon other disciplines to help inform us about what this cloth is. What is its significance? What does it mean? Cannot be answered by history alone. And history cannot explain for me the complexity of the image in the cloth. And that for me is the bottom line. And I'm the historian, so.
Awesome. All right, cool. So at this point, I want to bring in Caleb, I want to ask you guys some quick questions before we get into the next section. Is that okay, Hugh, or did you want to say something else, or?
Of course, yes. No. We're answering questions. Much better at answering questions than making statements.
No worries. Awesome. All right, cool. So I'll start off. I'm going to have a question for both of you guys. So first question, I'll start with Cheryl on this one, since this is Hugh's section technically. Okay, so it's interesting that as a historian, your basis for thinking the Shroud is special isn't necessarily based on the historical evidence.
Right.
So that's going to be interesting in the next section then. But it's based on the image characteristics, the physical and chemical features and that sort of thing. So I'm just sort of curious because I'm sort of unique in the pro-Shroud community where I say I don't care about, pretend the Shroud is medieval. And I say, who cares? As long as we can prove that the images are probably miraculous. And that doesn't necessarily speak to supernatural versus natural or anything like that. That's ultimately all that matters in establishing the case. God can do a miracle in the medieval ages, let alone the first century or in the future. So that's more of a philosophical thing. But what do you make of that, a case on that, just saying that who cares about the historical provenance?
Well, I mean, I think that, again, honest scholarship about something so complex. This is the single most studied artifact in the world we're talking about, by the way. There is not another object known to exist that more academic scrutiny has been brought to bear on. And the only way that I think we can approach it is through that integrated interdisciplinary approach. History does not hold all the answers. And I have to tell you that in the absence of new document discoveries and the absence of new information we don't know to this point, I don't think we should be looking too much to history, except to be looking for more evidence. In the record that we have, I think we've exhausted it. So yeah, I mean, I do rely much more upon looking at the Shroud from an interdisciplinary perspective. What can I know about it as a textile? What can I know about it forensically? What do I know about it from the image formation question problem? There's so much more to this than history can answer. History can contribute to the conversation. I don't want to mislead anyone. We can contribute, but we need to be looking back into sources with a sort of a new inquiring eye. Maybe some things we haven't looked at before that we need to, or things we need to look at again. But no 13th century document is going to say the burial cloth of Christ that bears this length of an image with this type blood and this pollen and this limestone. We're not going to find anything that correlates in the historical record to what we know today. So that's the limitation I see.
Gotcha. All right, perfect. And for you, Hugh, so your case was interesting because you didn't go down the typical route and base it on the memorandum. You more based it on this external document, this papal bull, to present your case, kind of thing. So I just wanted to get from you. So as you probably know, I sent you that link by Gary Valenkin, I think it is, where he lists about a dozen documents. So there's a bunch of papal documents. The last one confirms from 1390 affirms the authenticity. So it kind of seems like the Pope's going back and forth and that sort of stuff in his judgments based on the letters that we have. So I wanted you to respond. Yeah, what do you make of these other documents? Is that true? Yeah, what do you make of that stuff? Oh, I think you're frozen, or are you there, Hugh? Okay, he just really didn't want to answer my question, I guess.
You want to answer the question?
Yes, up and then you
Oh, so sorry, Hugh.
the great stack.
You cut out there. Do you want to just start over again because we didn't hear what you were saying before?
Can you? Oh yes, there's a stack of documents from about 13 40-ish to about 13, well, are printed in papers by Ulysse Chevalier. Is that his name? Yes. And they detail various correspondences where the bishop tried to get the shroud confiscated. He complained to the Pope. He complained to the king. The king tried to get it confiscated. The people in the church refused to let it go. And in the end, the Pope said, look, I've made my decision. I've told you what to do. Now shut up. And condemned him to perpetual silence. But I don't think there's much more to say. I don't think there's anything which in the 1390s, you said that it says the shroud was authentic. I don't think that's the case, apart from the fact that Darcy, in his memorandum, claims that the Dean of Leary Chapel said it was authentic 30 years earlier.
Gotcha. All right, perfect. So yeah, Caleb, I want to invite you to come on and just ask a couple questions for our guests based on that section there.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of background to your listeners, I am kind of on the fence. I don't really have a position either way, so I was kind of hoping this would be a good way to pull me to one side or the other as far as the position goes. So I'll ask each person one question for now. So I guess going back to Hugh for a second, I know that Cheryl brings up the 17, I think you said it was, features, and I hear that a lot. So, and then you mentioned Simon, you said De Martini. So I guess the question is, how would you respond to, do you think that there are people, or there are ways that we could replicate those features today, or that they could have been replicated back then? Because that seems to be the area that most of the big shroud advocates hold to, not necessarily the historical one, but, well, look at this, this is very hard to explain. So how do modern historians typically deal with those features?
Modern scientists tend to look at each feature individually and find out, is it true, or must it demonstrate that the shroud is what it says it is? So I'm only going to, I'll just mention one which typifies all sorts of approaches to shroud science by people who've studied it. This is the thing about the limestone. It is alleged that some of the sticky tape samples that were taken by Ray Rogers have little particles of limestone on them. Now, it's often announced that these particles of limestone were observed on the heel, the knee, and the nose. This is completely untrue. No samples were taken of the knee and the nose. So anybody who's observed a bit of dust can't say that it was any kind of limestone at all. The only samples which have been actually studied and found to be limestone are from the heel. Mm-hmm. Now, when we look at these little pieces of limestone, they are something called underwater. It's a product of a particular crystal called calcite, but about a third of the world's limestone is aragonite. Now, it's usually announced that aragonite is incredibly rare, just because there's less of it than calcite. But it's not incredibly rare, it's incredibly common. In fact, it's found almost where there is any limestone about. There is lots of aragonite, for example, in the Champagne area of France. In other words, exactly where Leary is. There is lots of aragonite in the area of Italy, just south of Turin. There's aragonite. Aragonite is named after Aragon, which is in Spain. So the people who took the shroud sample and said, look, I found some aragonite, they then went straight to Jerusalem and said, look, I found some aragonite here. Now, had they gone straight to Leary, they would also have found aragonite. They would have found aragonite if they'd been to Peru or Malaya. But because they only chose the sample that would fit their presuppositions, it matched. And this is exactly what happened to choose another example, with the pollen. With pollen grains, Max Fry found that he'd got some pollen. And he thought, I wonder what this is. He said, I'll go to Palestine and I'll grab some flowers and I'll look at their pollen. And if I find anything that looks the same, I'll say that my bit of pollen came from Palestine. Now, his bit of pollen and all his bits of pollen, they're an interesting shape. They look like COVID viruses, to be honest. They're little round balls with spikes on them. And they match thistles of various kinds from all over the world. But he didn't test, there were no controls. All he did was to go and test pollen from Palestine, see if there was a bit of a match, and assume the one matched the other. And I think you'll find that with almost every little piece of evidence that I've found on the Shroud, people have not done sufficient controls. I've just been writing a massive article about the Stirp investigation, and dear Heller and Adler, John Heller and Alan Adler, who investigated the little fibers that were found on the sticky tapes. But almost all the fibers that they investigated were from tapes that had blood on them, or were supposed to have blood. They couldn't compare them to tapes which had nothing on them because they didn't have any controls. And fortunately, just recently, Barry Schwartz has published a whole bunch of photographs taken by Eugenia Nitowski, the lady who was involved in the Aragonite thing. And you can find fibers of all kinds on all different sorts of from all over the Shroud. You can find little particles, you can find completely clear fibers, you can find yellow fibers, brown fibers, burnt fibers. They are all over the Shroud, all of them. I've got a note saying my connection is unstable, so I hope you can still hear me. What they needed to do was to compare these things quantitatively, but nobody did that. And that sort of thing bothers me quite a lot. Does that answer? I'm not sure what your question was, but I hope that answers it.
Yeah, I think it was about the 17 characteristics. So if I understand your answer properly, those were 3 characteristics, but I mean, we could go into lots of others. Sure, right. Now, I don't think we have time to go into all of them, but so I guess your point is that if you take them individually and scrutinize them, they're not that impressive, whereas they have to. Okay. Yeah. So you just
I was speaking of the 17 characteristics that are specific to the image. I was not talking about other evidence that appears on the cloth, for which there is a broad scientific consensus. I would encourage people to go and do the research. Just read the peer-reviewed research that's out there. Mm-hmm. But I was speaking, to Hugh's point, I was speaking specifically about, I always come back to the complexity of the image itself and the lack of a medieval explanation for that. For that matter, the lack of a 21st century explanation.
Right. So Cheryl, yeah, Mike.
Give an example. Name.
Well,
No, they can finish it. He can finish his point.
Okay.
The fact that the image is, we did not know until 1898 when it was first photographed, that the image is actually what you're looking at with the naked eyes. It's photographic negative, and the positive image is actually what is seen on the photographic negative. That is quite an unusual characteristic for someone to understand photography in the Middle Ages, and certainly the inverse of photography as a principle would have been unknown and unheard of. It's undocumented. Speaking of history, there you have no history. The other image characteristic is its three-dimensionality, the fact that it is in pure, perfect 3D relief on the very top fibrils of the linen itself. Those 2 characteristics alone make it unique enough that it has become the most studied art. That's why it's the most studied artifact. It's not because of anything else. It's the image itself.
Awesome. All right, Caleb, I'll let you ask one quick question to Cheryl, because I just want to make sure Cheryl has a fair opportunity to give her opening case, like her case and that sort of thing. But yeah, Caleb, do you have one quick question for Cheryl based on that section?
Yeah, well, this is not like directly based on what she said, but like historically, when we look at it, one of the things for me was that's among other things, was the image on the shroud itself. Like the depiction of Christ to me looks kind of standard to what a European presentation would be with the height and stuff. So is there like historically reasons why that might be consistent with what a Palestinian Jew would look like? 'Cause I don't remember how tall he is, if he's like 6 foot something.
Yeah, he's
but
approximately 5'10" to 5'11" tall. The man of the shroud is.
mhm.
And I've had, I often get asked that question after presentations. People will say, well, isn't that tall to be a first century Jew? And my answer is always, no, actually that's tall to be a medieval European. We have ossuaries, for instance. There's some anthropological evidence out there of first century Jewish burials and femur measurements that indicate that 5'10" or 5'11" might have been on the high side of the tall side of average, but it's certainly not unknown. Because of the conditions, the poor living conditions, for instance, in medieval Europe and the poor diets, we have also similar comparisons in battlefield excavations of medieval warriors, soldiers, archers, for instance, and know that men tended to be much shorter in the Middle Ages. So again, probably diet related. And so my answer to that is always, well, no, it's not. We can't go on his height or weight, okay, to say that it's medieval or ancient. I think we've exhausted that. I always, as I said, and I hate to keep sort of pounding the drum here, but I always come back to the image formation process. Nothing that I know about the Middle Ages permits me to entertain the idea that it was a medieval creation by an artist. And I've been down that road. I've been all over the place with this in the 40 years I've studied it. And I'm left with the big question about that. Who could create an image that they couldn't even see? The complexity of it is revealed in negative photography and by the VP8 analysis of 1976.
Dale, did you want to take it from there?
Awesome. Yeah. So at this point, I wanted to turn it over to the second section. So in the first section, we started off with Hugh giving his sort of case, and then Cheryl was coming back on that. Cheryl, now it's your turn. I want you to give your sort of case about the shroud, and then Hugh will come back on that.
Sure. So, I mean, from a historical perspective, there are many references to something that was being venerated before the 14th century. Obviously, I've already said that my greatest challenge with that is both philosophically and historically is that we are limited by our vocabulary. We're restricted to understanding. Are we talking about, is the image of Edessa, for instance, the same thing that's the Shroud of Turin? Is the image of Edessa that what is being described in Edessa in the 6th century? Is that the same thing that shows up in the imperial record in 944 in Constantinople? Is it the same thing that's described in a diary in 1204 by one of the Western Crusaders? There's no way to know that. And so in the absence of any external rubric by which to judge that historical narrative, I think that has to remain a question. I'm always intrigued by some of the earlier references to something like this. I wish there were a way to know more about it. For instance, at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787, it was read into the record from a homily of Saint Athanasius, who was 4th century bishop of Alexandria. And in that, he references an image of our Lord at full length that was taken from Jerusalem to Antioch when Jerusalem fell in the year 70. So I've always been interested in that. What is he talking about? There's nothing else that we know that exists as a relic that he could be talking about. So there's these question marks that come throughout the historical record. The shroud that shows up in Constantinople in 944 that may have in fact disappeared from that city in 1204. That 141 year gap is of interest to me, from 1204 to 1355. But I mean, I think again, what we know about it historically only tells us we don't know enough yet, and we need to continue to look. For me, as I think I've sort of exhausted this point now, it always comes back to the inexplicability of the image. based on my understanding of medieval Europe. So that's the big stopping point for me. If it could be proved, somehow that there's a process we do not yet know about, that this could have been done in the 14th century, I would certainly be open to knowing that. I'd leave that question open. In the absence of that, for me, it remains an open question, and one that we just need to continue to study. That the great mystery of this pulls us in, and contemplating the mystery sometimes is enough to bring our thinking where it's supposed to be. So that's my final take on it. I mean, we can talk about documents all day long, but those documents don't answer the question of how this image was formed and why we can't do it today.
Awesome. All right. So Hugh, I want to turn it over to you. Do you want to give kind of an opening speech responding to Cheryl's case there? Oh, I think he's frozen again. Oh, can you hear me, Hugh? Or?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, we can hear you now. Yeah.
I can still hear you. I can see you. Yeah, I think it's a little bumpy as it goes along. Sometimes I get a delay and you go crackly, but then it sort of catches up on itself. So perhaps that's something to do with it. Anyway, so yeah, I take Cheryl's main point, I think, which is that it's just the shroud. Its appearance is stunning, and I agree with that, and I agree with everything that she said. But from a scientist point of view, we have to look at it rather more dispassionately. So I'm going to ask what may seem a silly question, and then I'm going to answer it, but then you might be able to build up on this. I'm going to say, what makes you think it's a negative? And the answer will be, normally, that the colors of the light, I will ask you to look at my face and say, is my nose brighter than my cheeks? And as you look at it, I think you'll agree that it's not. Did Jesus have white hair? I mean, if it's a negative, his hair is white. All of it's white. His moustache is white. His long tresses are white. And if Jesus had white hair, that would contribute to the negative idea. He's reputed to have some severe bruises on his cheek. And characteristically to me, bruises tend to be darker and the swellings are darker than the surrounding skin. But on this alleged negative, the bruises are lighter than the skin. In fact, the more you look at it, the less this image looks like a negative. It has some of the characteristics of a negative. In other words, it has a black background, basically. But
no, the photographic negative.
When you look at it in great detail, you start thinking it's not. No, the positive has yes, the negative of the shroud has a black background, and that makes people think that it's like a chalk drawing or something like that. But in fact, if you look at a drawing on chalk, a chalk drawing on black paper, it tends to have negative characteristics. Because the only way you can highlight things is by using the chalk in a reverse kind of way. How can you draw hair on someone on black paper? You have to put white lines on it, and so the hair appears a bit white, but that doesn't mean that the hair actually is white. So photonegativity, it's not. What there is, and what confuses people, I think, is the three-dimensional characteristics, and I'll certainly agree with that. However, if we put the shroud into the famous VP8 image analyzer, or for those of us who don't have such a thing, if you bung it into any image manipulating software, of which Image J, for example, is the one I use, and it's free, which is always very helpful, we can make all sorts of things have three-dimensional qualities. And the shroud, when you put it under same with the VPH or image J, it looks exactly like a bas relief. It doesn't look like a perfect three-dimensional model, which, of course, you never see when you see videos of people looking at on the VP8. But if you turn the alleged 3D representation sideways, it appears almost flat. It doesn't look like a person at all. So it doesn't really have proper 3D image characteristics. To me, it has the sort of 3D characteristics that might be expected if you covered a bas relief with paint and laid the shroud flat on top of it. Where the cloth was pressed against the bas relief, the upper portions of it, the ink would be stronger, and where it was, and this sort of thing can be done, and I have done it with little bas reliefs, but they tend to be very small, and produced images which look appropriate. I wouldn't have said that I've proved anything or even demonstrated that the shroud was a good example of it, but it's the sort of thing that can be addressed scientifically. It can look amazing, but in production, I've lost you all.
Okay. Oh, okay. Sorry. Were you? I was waiting for you to.
Are you back?
Yeah, we're back. Can you hear us and everything? You're kind of cutting
Yeah,
out.
oh, that's good. Yeah.
So I just wanted to check in. All right, cool. So yeah, I want to make sure we have some time for back and forth. So, Cheryl, do you want to discuss with Hugh your case and what he had to say about it?
No, I don't really have anything else to add other than, again, going back to these 17 image characteristics, and if it were this easy as Hugh describes to create this a bas relief, then I think there would be millions of these things out there. Why did this medieval artist, who had an advanced knowledge of blood splatter forensics, negative photography, and forensic blood flow, how did this person only create one such masterpiece? I mean, and by what process? If Hugh is asking me to accept that this is some sort of a medieval bas relief using ink or pigments or dyes of which there are none on the cloth, I cannot go there. I refuse to accept that. Now, scientifically, honest scientific inquiry, I'm interested in. But that is absolutely, to me, an absurd suggestion. Understanding what I do about medieval art and artists, who is this person? How did he do it or she do it? And matched every single one of the image characteristics, including the density of the image, the distance of the image from the points of the proximity of the cloth to the human subject, the blood flow and blood spatter, which is forensically accurate to the wounds that are depicted. And oh, by the way, the blood is present on the cloth before the image. So all of these things that have to be matched, that for me is the big question at the end of the day. That's where the mystery is. And a logic has to lead me down a very different path than Hugh Farey today. I just want to say that. Logic leads me somewhere else. Not necessarily to the supernatural, but to something that more appropriately explains all of the image characteristics, not just a few of them.
Gotcha. All right, cool. And sorry, Hugh, I didn't mean to cut you off there with the delayed stuff, but
yes, well, I'll certainly come back on that.
Sure.
Okay. Oh, am I stable enough?
Yeah, it sounds good.
You can hear me? Right. Let's of these 17 image characteristics, Cheryl's only mentioned a few, but she's mentioned the blood several times. So the anatomical precision, let's imagine, of the blood. We have, say, take the wrist wound, for example, which has been very, very precisely identified by Pierre Barbet, who was a battlefield surgeon,
Right.
and following his lead by Robert Bucklin, who was the county coroner for Los Angeles. And it was exactly identified as a wound going through the space of destot, which is a small space between some of the bones in the wrist. So that you couldn't get much more precise than that, and it would demonstrate an unusual
So okay. Yeah,
anatomical
just so you know, Hugh, we can hear what you're saying. It's very delayed.
accuracy.
So just wait a couple seconds.
Until Fred Zugibay from New York comes and looks at it and announces that Barbet was an idiot and that in fact the wrist wound was, the space of destot was in the wrong. Is that all right? Am I sorry?
It's working now, yeah. Oh, for a while there, we didn't hear a big chunk of what you were saying. Oh, okay. Hello, can you hear us, Hugh? You're muted, just so you know if you're talking.
I've come back. I fell out. Sorry,
Yeah.
I fell out and the disconnected and then it reconnected.
No worries. Yeah, I was just telling you, I missed a large chunk of what you were saying.
I'll
if you just want to.
Right. I was just saying that the. It's gone off again. Oh, no. Are you with me still?
You're good.
Make a symbol. Make a symbol. Oh, good. So the anatomical precision of not sufficiently precise for two experts to agree where it is. Now, I don't think Zugibay was an idiot or Bucklin, but these three people disagreed about something quite simple, like where a hole was in a wrist. And then some more, Giulio Fanti and his Italian friends have come up with another place. Exactly, and done it with immense precision. Giulio does everything with incredible precision, or at least so he claims. And he's come up with another place. And in fact, as one of my articles in the British Society for the Turin Shroud newsletter has, there are 5 different possibilities which 5 highly qualified forensic pathologists have identified as the place where the wound was. Now, that does not speak to me of anatomical precision. It could have been anywhere. It's a splodge of blood. To say that it's accurate.
You just underscored one of the most significant points. You just underscored it beautifully. This is why it remains the single most studied artifact in the world.
Oh, yes.
Is because every question is answered with a new question, and it remains a great mystery.
But
I
we
was
can't
speaking
say
specifically of the blood flow on the arms and on the back, and from the wounds.
Right. So the blood flow on the arms is wholly unrealistic and has never been duplicated by anybody. Never. The only people who've attempted to duplicate it
I don't think that's
were Luigi Gallascelli and his chums, and they demonstrated that the blood ran straight down. If you hold your arm upwards, or if you hold it like that, it runs straight off. And I believe John Jackson was going to carry out an experiment in order to show that they were wrong. But if he did it, he never published it because he found that it's actually impossible by doing this to try and get those ridiculous blood flows to look. They don't look realistic at all. They look as if someone's drawn a series of S's down the side of the back of the hand. What's more, we can demonstrate when these blood flows were supposed to have occurred. When you pump a nail through somebody's arm, blood doesn't come out because the nail is plugging the hole. And when you take the nail out, well, if the hand has been higher than the head for the last 3 hours, there won't be enough blood. The only way you might get blood to come out is if you hold the arm upside down, in which case maybe some blood would dribble down and it would come out of that. You see, these are when things are physiologically precise. But when you try and analyze every single one, it turns out it doesn't happen. It's not true. The blood flows are not anatomically precise.
Well,
they're vague
Okay, yeah, let's let Cheryl come back on the blood.
Mm-hmm.
No, the only thing I can really say about that, because I'm not a forensic pathologist, but the only thing I can say about that is that I did where I'm speaking on this issue is primarily informed by my training with Dr. John Jackson at his Turin Shroud Center, and having read the published summary of findings from STIRP and from the follow-up projects to that. There is, as Hugh has pointed out, a great diversity among scientists about their interpretations of this. So to me, again, just to go back to my original point, it underscores why we continue to study it, to learn as much as we can about it. And it seems like the only thing I would say that might be remotely reflective of a religious perspective would be to say this, that if this is an object of the material world, it will most surely give up its mysteries. Things of the material world always do. This so far has defied that philosophical expectation. And at the end of the day, guys, that's where I am with it.
Fair enough.
Perfect.
Fair enough.
All right, cool. So yeah, just out of respect for time, I want to finish off with a quick question period and that sort of thing. So I'll start us off before I go to Caleb, and this will be a question for both of you to answer at the same time. So obviously this show was this show is meant to be about the historical evidence, and I get that both of you guys don't think we can make a conclusion either way, but maybe do you guys want to just share both of your takes on some of the factors that people give historically to say that it's not medieval? So for example, there's comparison with certain 6th century images and coins. There's a link to the Sudarium of Oviedo, which that's forensic evidence. It kind of links the bloodstains and fluids together. So yeah, so this was Cheryl's section. So I'll start with you, Hugh. What's your take on some of these things? And then I'll give it to Cheryl to answer afterwards.
Yes, there are a handful of, as it were, classic historical proofs that the shroud existed before the 14th century. So one of them is the alleged map, which has been carbon dated twice to the 7th or 8th century, and the bloodstains on the shroud. But if you consider the bloodstains on the face of the Sudarium, they are a massive, vague splodge. Whereas there are no bloodstains on the face of the shroud. There are a few trickling down the sides. So it can't be said that the face of the Sudarium or any of the bloodstains on the face of the Sudarium match the shroud in any way at all. There are, apparently, off to the side, there are some much more intense little bloodstains which allegedly match the bloodstains on the back of the shroud, the back of the head of the person in the shroud, where a very, very vague picture of the shroud and another very vague picture of the Sudarium are quickly slid together, and somebody goes, look, they match perfectly. And I challenge anybody to actually draw the bloodstains of the shroud and the bloodstains of the Sudarium and see that they don't in fact match at all. But this is the sort of thing that they are supposed to do. Another one that's often popped up all the time, which is quite extraordinary to me, is the Prey Codex, the Hungarian book, which contains 5 images, 5 pictures, one of which shows the on one page 2 pictures. The top half is the anointing of the dead body of Christ, and the bottom half is an absolutely classic example of the icon of the three Matis ceremony, which I was mentioning earlier. Ladies holding spices and incense. It has an angel in exactly the right place. It has a tomb in exactly the place where all the other tombs in all the other pictures are put. And it has a lid of the tomb in exactly the same place as all the other lids on all the other pictures are put. And it has a shroud crumpled up on top of that lid. But because there are four rather mysterious holes in the shape of an L, which look a little bit like some holes in the shroud,
A little bit.
and they are on the lid of the sarcophagus and the Prayer Codex, people have announced that out of completely extraordinarily and totally out of context, this lid is in fact the shroud. And that's something which I don't believe at all. Do you want another one?
Oh, awesome.
All right.
Yeah,
Another one is the...
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead and give this one, and I want to give it to Cheryl.
One more.
Yeah, sure. One more. Go ahead.
One more. The lovely account of Robert de Clary. Robert de Clary, he's the crusader who arrives in Constantinople just in time for it to be complete his walk around Constantinople. And he visits the Pharos chapel in the big palace, and he sees the shroud, the burial cloth of Christ, and he sees the mandilion. He sees the two different things. And then he moves on to discuss something else. And then in a footnote at the end of the chapter, he mentions that there is another church in which the burial cloth of Jesus is raised every Friday afternoon, and everyone has assumed that this is evidence of the shroud, which, I'm going a bit wobbly on my connection. Everyone assumes that this is the evidence that this object that he saw in the Blackernay chapel was the shroud. But what nobody seems to have, well, a few people have understood that in fact there was, and it's well documented, something that happened every afternoon in that chapel, and it was a sheet that rose up with a full-length image, but it wasn't Jesus, it was the Virgin Mary. The chapel was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, and the sheet was a picture of the Virgin Mary. So Robert de Clary had simply he hadn't seen it, he had heard about it, and he had heard that it was somebody holy, and he assumed, or who wrote, that it was the image of Jesus that was lifted up every Friday, when in fact, for centuries beforehand, well no, for 50 years beforehand, it was the image of Mary that was lifted up every Friday. So those are three classic historical evidences for the shroud before the 14th century, which I don't think hold.
Okay, perfect. All right, cool. So Cheryl, yeah, do you want to give your take on some of these historical evidences that shroud people appeal to?
Sure. So just real quickly, the Sudarium of Oviedo, I don't think there's any debate about the blood type being the exact same on both of these cloths. I have read in peer-reviewed journals that the forensic pathologist that will testify that these cloths cover the face of the same man. If that is in fact the case, we know where the Sudarium of Oviedo has been since the year about 613. So if those two cloths came into contact with one another, then it had to have been before that point in time. I think that there's a significant question. Again, don't have the answer historically, but I think there's enough question we should continue looking at that. I cannot so easily dismiss it as Hugh has. The second thing about the Hungarian Prayer Codex, I could not disagree more vehemently about. It is, as he says, these four holes that just happen to look something like what are on the shroud. They look exactly like the burn holes on the shroud. And not only that, the artist has gone to some great length to duplicate the pattern of the shroud itself, and in fact, the shows Jesus with four fingers on each hand. I mean, why on earth? I mean, even a medieval monk in the 12th century knew that Jesus had 5 fingers on each hand. Why did he draw him with only 4? I mean, the image on the shroud shows only 4 fingers on each hand because the thumbs were retracted. The third thing is, and I'm trying to remember now, we're talking about Robert de Clary's Conquest of Constantinople. It might be in a footnote that he says this, but he says very clearly that the Church of St. Mary de Blacarny, every Friday, an image of our Lord stood up at full length. Now, the full length is interesting because Dr. John Jackson, I believe, has demonstrated this. And again, this is published, that we can account for fold lines in the cloth and know that at some point in its history, it probably was displayed that way, that it was in a box perhaps that was cranked open, so to expose different layers of the image itself. So all of these things, again, these historical evidences, again, only point to our need to study more about it, to know more about it. They cannot be just easily dismissed. The complexities of this, for me, are just not that simple. I mean, to look at the Hungarian Prayer Codex and say that they look something like the burn holes, the L-shaped burn holes in two places. No, it's identical. And so I have a big question about that and many other things. One of the things that's always been compelling to me are the as you mentioned, the coins, the Byzantine era, that suddenly in artwork and in coinage, the image of Jesus begins to look much more like a Semitic male than the young Roman youth that you find in the catacombs. At some point in history, in that transition between the first few centuries of the church and the depiction of Jesus in art, he took a dramatic turn. He no longer looks like the young the young Roman male with short hair. Now he looks very Semitic and much more like the Jesus we know of art today. So what caused that, I think, obviously we cannot account for a major shift in art history without some kind of explanation. And I think, again, that's one more thing that draws us into the study of this, our understanding of Christ, which again goes back to make kind of a simple point I think neither one of us have talked about, is that there is really no question, is there, that that's who's depicted on this cloth? It doesn't matter what you think about it. There's no question that the person in it is supposed to be Jesus of Nazareth. There's no other person of history we'd be talking about if it weren't for the narrative we know about him. So yeah, lots and lots of questions, Dale, and I know we don't have time, but this is why this is the most studied object in history, and why it will continue to draw people into the mystery.
Gotcha. All right. Do you mind just one quick follow-up before I bring in Caleb
Sure.
to ask you guys both a question?
Okay.
Just out of clarity, your position. So I understand. Forget the physical, chemical characteristics. Based on the historical evidence of the nature we've been talking about, you mentioned that we have to be agnostic. We can't say one way or the other in terms of the authenticity of dating back to Jesus, or do you think that it does speak that the shroud is, we can prove on a balance of probabilities that the shroud is centuries older than the medieval period? We just can't link it to Jesus, or like what is it you're saying?
Yeah, I do think that where the historical record is confusing or silent, that's how we have to read it. I'm a purist in this regard. I don't think we read into the record what is not there. And while I pointed out, for instance, what was read into the record at Second Nicaea, the sermon of St. Athanasius, I find very compelling. What relic is he describing? Well, I'm agnostic in the sense that I truly don't know what he is describing. Could it be the same cloth that's in Turin, Italy today? Yes. Could it not be? Yes. No. So do you see my point is that we cannot read into the record what is not clearly there. But I think we can take the record in total and begin to ask more questions to fill in the blanks, till we reach that epistemological endpoint I was talking about, where we can begin to believe that, yes, this actually could be the same cloth we're talking about in St. Paul's letter to the Galatians, or in the epistle to the Hebrews, the non-canonical text, to some of the hymn of the pearl, some of those early church documents that are often referenced. But no, I think as a historian, in the purest sense, and the integrity of my discipline demands a rigor that we be honest, that don't read what's not there. Connect the dots where you can. And I think the caution is the same on the other side. don't use one or two documents to exclude the possibility that it may in fact have a first century provenance.
Gotcha. Perfect. All right, cool. Thank you for clarifying that. So yeah, Caleb, I know you've been sitting there very patiently, so I'm going to let you finish off the show with a question for both of our guests.
Okay, yeah. So I have one for each of them. So, first, let me have a quick comment. I thought it was interesting when Hugh was talking about the photographic negative aspect about Jesus having white hair, because that reminded me of the descriptions of the glorified Christ in Revelation and in Transfiguration. It's like, that's kind of, if Jesus did undergo some kind of glorification at the resurrection, is that not consistent with it? But I won't go into that because I know that's speculation. But my question is, for me, it seems like you could draw some parallels with other things in history of when is the absence of historical documentation the absence of evidence? Because one of the relics that I think is most interesting is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and we don't have any reference to this until Eusebius. And yet, I think because many, I don't know if this is within your all's fields, but I believe a very large portion of archaeologists do in fact think that there's a good chance, you don't know for certain, but that there's a good chance it's to be authentic because of the archaeology and that we can date it to certain things, even if we don't have the actual people writing saying, yes, people were doing this. And so if the tomb of Christ could go without being written about for centuries, is it not implausible to think that a cloth of the same kind might not necessarily be explicitly mentioned, but other evidence could imply that it's earlier? So I didn't know what Hugh would think of that.
Well, yes, but the thing is, I'm a scientist. There has to be some evidence to support a hypothesis for me to credit the hypothesis as likely. So I can only say yes, possibly. The shroud was around then, but there's no evidence for it. And the Holy Sepulchre, as you mentioned, if Eusebius, whatever Eusebius says, the Holy Sepulchre is there. There's a great pile of stone and an edifice around it. And there's any number of pictures and documents of it from around about the time shortly before Queen Helena is supposed to have discovered the cross. So there are documents that go with it. But of the shroud, there are mentions of the burial cloth of Jesus, but they are clearly, they're never mentioned in connection with a picture. And there are mentions of pictures of Jesus, but they're never mentioned in connection with the burial cloth. Yes, there has to be evidence before a scientist will support a hypothesis.
Awesome. Mm-hmm. And Cheryl, my question to you is a comment you made about if something is natural, that we'll eventually discover the mystery of it. Because I've heard people draw similarities to Stonehenge or the pyramids of Giza and stuff, and say we don't know how these ancient people could have built this with their technology at the time, and so parts of this may remain a mystery. I think they say the same about Machu Picchu. So is that what's the epistemic standard as far as saying we don't know how this came, and this could be something more than natural?
Yeah, that's actually a great analogy, and I'm glad you brought those up, because I mean we actually do more or less understand. For instance, we use pyramids of Giza. We do know, of course, how those were built. I mean, that I think we've laid that to rest maybe 2 decades ago or so, that there's a pretty complex system, really simple to us today, but would have been complex for the ancient Egyptians, pulleys and levers, stone quarrying methods that we can replicate today. I don't know enough about Machu Picchu to answer that, but certainly in the case of Stonehenge, we do have some understanding, even scientifically, of the origin of those stones and how they might have gotten there. We have an understanding of the process of the building of the pyramids from the standpoint of physics and construction. I mean, we've actually recreated that entire process. This, to me, stands alone as something that is, that from this epistemological standpoint, is confounding. Because the more we know about it, the more we learn about it, the more we realize we don't know. We continue to have these questions. We've had a good century now of solid inquiry into it, and at least 40 plus years now of serious scientific inquiry. And from every single discipline. So why have we not answered all the questions if in fact we were meant to? So for me, that's why I still every day look at this anew as something that I can learn from.
Awesome. All right. Awesome. So, keeping us on track, I think we're just a couple minutes over the time deadline.
Yes.
But if you guys don't mind, you guys, both you and Cheryl and Hugh, do you guys want to just maybe take a couple minutes to give a closing statement or say any last things that you think would be important for the audience? And I guess I'll start. Oh, no. Hugh, did you say yeah? Or did you want to make a closing statement?
Not really. My advice to the audience
Okay, so
is
you're kind of cutting up.
go back to the prime.
Yeah, so you're cutting out again. So all right, so Cheryl, I'll go to you. You can give your closing statement, and hopefully,
My advice to the audience is to go to the primary sources.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Hello?
Yep.
Are you with
Go to
me?
the primary
I'll
source.
take a little time to catch up, I think.
You're good now.
Yes, that's
Okay.
exactly what I would tell people to do if you're really interested in learning more about this cloth, to go to the primary sources. Obviously, I would recommend shroud.com. It's the largest clearinghouse on the web of information about this. You can find it's fully searchable.
That's it. Go to the primary.
Go read it for yourself and begin to formulate your own questions. And I think that if anything, this interview has demonstrated how intricate and complex this issue is, and why, in fact, we're still talking about it today. Why we're still talking about the mystery of a 14.5-foot strip of linen cloth.
Awesome. All right, cool. Looks like we've lost Hugh, but yeah, I just want to say thank you to both you, Cheryl, and Hugh for coming on and having this great discussion.
Thank you.
I also thank you, Caleb, for coming on and helping me out. You asked great questions as always. So
Thank you.
yeah, I just want to say thank you guys.
Yeah, I was gonna make a quick thing real fast before. Well, I don't know if you just want to do this over email, but because so I know that Dale knows this, but I'm doing a pretty large book on miracles and stuff like that, and I think your all's expertise in like medieval history and relics would be interesting. So maybe setting up an interview in the future to inquire about certain things like that, because I don't know how you know about like especially like Eucharistic miracles like Lanciano and some of those relics that,
which we didn't even get into the Eucharistic miracles matching the blood type. We didn't even get into that.
Right. Yeah. I was going to ask questions, but I don't know whose opinion on those either, but I had lots of questions about like from that era of stuff. So that we put up something sometime if you want, but I'd really look forward to that.
Okay, good.
Awesome. All right, cool. So Hugh, hopefully, are you back, Hugh? I just want to say you're muted if you are. Okay. No.
All
right, cool. So I'm just going to end it out of respect for Cheryl's time. So yeah, okay. Thanks everyone again. And yeah, have a great week, everybody.
All right. Thanks for having me, Dale.